Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I thought that Carolyn Weitzman had some really interesting things to say about housing affordability. A couple of issues that she raised that a lot of other people haven't focused on is housing for the least fortunate in our society, homelessness, students, newcomers, people that are out of work. You know, she went through a whole list of people that require social housing, affordable housing, and don't have it in today's economy. I think a lot of the discussion that we've had about housing affordability has been general housing affordability for everyone, and it's been probably focused mostly on the middle class or the people that are maybe below middle class but not in huge need. But she really focuses on those in huge need, and the fact that she shows so much need, 1.5 million households needed for people that are really in need, on top of the 1.5 million extra homes that we need just for general level of affordability or more affordability, is kind of shocking. And you think about, what do we have a right for in our society? We should have a right for drinking water, for healthcare, and I think we should have a right for housing. And our federal government or provincial government or municipal governments have really made mistakes. And I think that we haven't really addressed it the way we need to address it, because I think this is an economic issue. There's no question about it. But I think a lot of the conversations have been more economics than they have been where I think the real issue is, which is it's really almost a moral issue, isn't it? We have restricted our housing so much through zoning, through regulation, through red tape, through delays, etc., that the vast majority of people, if they're young people, if they're newcomers, if they're renters that want to get into the housing market, can't afford it. I mentioned in our last chat a conversation I had with a Ivy Business School professor who said that 15 years ago, most of his students were optimistic about the future. And today, his students aren't optimistic about the future because they don't think that they're going to have a house. They're going to be able to afford a house in a major metropolitan area. And so therefore, they can't look for those jobs that they want in the major centers, Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. They have to think, they either have to think about other places to work or they have to think about a very long commute. And even if they have a long commute, the big house with the swimming pool is probably not something that's within their reach. When I graduated from university, my father told me that I could afford a house that was 3 times my income. Today in Toronto, it's 9.25. The median house is 9.25 times people's income. It's 3 times more expensive than my father said was the maximum I could afford. And it's unsustainable. We've heard these figures of 27 years to save for a down payment, let alone for the whole house. We have created a situation where we have far fewer housing starts today than we did when I was a kid. And our population is, increased by what? Almost 10 million, 15 million over that time period. So on a per capita basis, we're developing half on a per capita basis the number of homes that we did when I was a teenager and when I started working. It's a travesty. And again, why? It's because we have allowed our municipal governments to put in place a system where they allow NIMBYism, I guess, to have this influence on them, such that according to the CMHC and Stats Canada that came out with this report that I reported on last week, Toronto, the Greater Toronto Area, is the slowest in dealing with housing applications across Canada, other than Vancouver and Victoria. And because of that, we have the highest housing in affordability. And they directly see a correlation between red tape and the slowness of dealing with approvals in that red tape and lack of affordable housing. And that, other more rural communities in Ontario, across Canada, et cetera, will have a far quicker ability to deal with housing applications and will have far more affordable housing. And so what has this bought us? Has it bought us anything good? And I think a lot of municipal politicians and provincial politicians and federal politicians, but mostly municipal politicians, they need to look at themselves in the mirror and say, what I'm doing is effectively taking value away from young people, newcomers, renters that want to become homeowners, and transferring that value to older people that have got established homes that build up this value in these homes that make them unaffordable for absolutely everyone else. I interviewed a gentleman from Vancouver that is in this in charge of an intergenerational think tank. And he says this is the biggest transfer of wealth in history. That this is the first generation in history that are treating our young people worse than we're treating ourselves. The vast majority of generations in the past have always passed on a better opportunity to their following generations rather than a worse opportunity. And we're passing on a worse opportunity. If climate change is sort of one of those moral issues for our whole generation, I think housing is the issue of the day for our generation. And I think that this challenge that we just heard from our guest tonight, Carolyn Weitzman, that said that housing is a federal responsibility and should be a federal priority, and we're spending billions of dollars, and that, you know, after World War II, it was the federal government that got involved in housing that allowed, with Victory Housing and other programs, returning war vets to be housed. And that we had programs in the 50s and the 60s. But we've lost our way in that regard. And that the provincial government is doing a lot to try to get rid of some of the red tape in housing today and forcing things down on municipalities. But because of a lack of collaboration, a lack of communication, a lack of cooperation, they're encountering resistance from municipalities. And they're not, according to Carolyn, addressing at all social housing, which has been clearly one of the focuses of the new mayor of Toronto, Olivia Chow. Social housing, affordable housing for the most underprivileged and in need in our community. So I think we have to take a step back, look at ourselves in the mirror, and ask ourselves, what good, of any, has our zoning regulations, our red tape, our slow approval processes, our NIMBYism done? And I think what it's done is it's robbed our young people of the dream of a house that was part of the Canadian dream. It has robbed our newcomers of an opportunity. We're hearing now of newcomers that are coming here, are homeless, and are leaving again after we spend all the time and effort of recruiting them to come here. And of renters and lower income people that want to get into the housing market. We've stolen that opportunity from them. This is a moral issue where we put in development charges that are a tax on young people and effectively giving it to older people, because the older people aren't paying the property taxes that they should be paying, because we're offloading some of the tax burden that municipalities should be sharing amongst all the people in the population and pushing it on to the young people, to the newcomers, and to the renters that want to become homeowners. We are allowing NIMBYism to exist in our communities, that we don't want to have group homes. We don't want to have social housing. We don't want to have affordable housing. We don't want to have more housing. We don't want to have dense housing. 85-90% of Toronto, the Greater Toronto Area, is still single-family homes. And yet we object when there's density. We object when there's height. We object when there's any kind of social or affordable housing. And yet we don't realize that the end result of all that objection, of all that red tape, of all that regulation, of all that delay, creates a situation where housing has gone up at several multiples of real growth in GDP. That housing inaffordability is at an extreme. That housing on a percentage of income basis in Canada is twice what it is in the United States. And the United States we thought was in this bubble territory in 2007 and 2008, and it went down. We didn't. We just kept on going up. And so I think that a lot of the issues that have been addressed so far on this housing affordability crisis have been primarily economic. And I think what we've got to do is say, yes, this is an economic issue, but more importantly, it's a moral issue. We should want to give the next generation a good opportunity. We should want to give that next generation an opportunity to buy a house, to live that Canadian dream of a house and a garage and a park and a yard and a pool if they so choose. And we're not doing it, and we're not doing it because the older generation, my generation, in aggregate, is greedy and have allowed that net worth to grow in our housing because we benefited from the lack of supply and the buildup of housing. And we think that that creates us as richer people, but it doesn't. Because if we sell our house, we are buying an overvalued house. Our house currently may be overvalued, but we're buying an overvalued house. If housing prices went down, we could sell a lower valued house, but buy a lower valued house. And so this paper profit that we've made in our housing is really a fiction. It's not real. But because of it, because of this NIMBYism that's forced municipal politicians to be NIMBY themselves, we're robbing the next generation of the opportunity that we had. And it's wrong, and it's got to stop. And we, the people, have to tell our municipal politicians, our provincial politicians, and our federal politicians to sit down, collaborate, and solve this housing crisis. And the solution has got to be less red tape, less regulations, less zoning rules, quicker, far quicker approvals. It takes twice or three times as long to get a development approved as it does to actually build the development. That's a definition of red tape. I had 3 people in the last 2 weeks that I've interviewed say this is the worst Soviet-like central planning regulatory red tape system that we've created. Didn't work in Soviet Union. Why are we allowing it to be the way that we run our housing system? And at the same time, as we dramatically reduce that red tape and quicken up the approval process, as we just heard, we need the federal government, the provincial government to make land available so that we can build, in cooperation with the private sector, housing for the least advantaged in our community. 1.5 million extra homes is what we need across Canada for the least able to afford housing. And in Southern Ontario, we need 1.8 million homes in the next 10 years, incremental to what we otherwise would have built, to have general less inaffordability, greater affordability. It's a big challenge. And the only way I think that we're going to address this is if we take it and address it not only as an economic issue, but a moral issue. We have done something wrong. Our politicians have done something wrong. We are robbing our children of the Canadian dream of owning a house. And it's wrong, and it's our responsibility to make it right. Thanks. That's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour for tonight. Good night, everybody.